In this video, I'm going to show you how to get ZX Spectrum set up on an Xbox Series X and S through Retroarch. The ZX Spectrum is another one of those microcomputers that was really big in the UK back in the 80s and early 90s. While they did come to the States, they didn't have anywhere near the reception they did over in the UK, so they weren't very popular here. Not a whole lot of stuff was released here. But a number of game companies really got their start on the system, including Rare. And honestly, my first real experience with ZX Spectrum stuff actually came because of Rare games. Donkey Kong 64 included unlockable ZX Spectrum games like Jetpack, and then of course the Rare Replay includes things like Saberwolf, Underworld, whatever that gun one was, I can't remember its name right now. But I've become quite fond of learning about the system because of this. And thanks to emulation, there is a way we could play these games without having the original hardware. And there's even archive sites that have tons of free games available for the system that are legal to get. So let's dig in. Now to get started with ZX Spectrum emulation, we need ZX Spectrum games. And as I said, there is a site dedicated to hosting all kinds of abandoned ZX Spectrum games. So the website World of Spectrum hosts a huge archive of ZX Spectrum software and information. So if you're looking to pick up some legal ZX Spectrum games, you can find them here. Of course, not everything is hosted here, so some of it's just archival information about screenshots and things like that. Like Rampage is still copyrighted by Activision, so this one isn't available to download. But you could go to the archive, go to the game's software list, and you can find things to download here. But once you find games that you want to add to your ZX Spectrum library, they're going to be in a variety of different formats. So you've got TAP, TZX, RZX, Z80, and these will all run under the ZX Spectrum emulator in Retroarch. Now, one of the greatest things about ZX Spectrum emulation is we don't need any BIOS files to run a vast majority of ZX Spectrum games. According to the official Retroarch documentation, we can emulate Spectrum 48K, Palin NTSC Systems 128K, plus 2, plus 2A, plus 3, plus 3E, SE, the Timex versions, the Spectrum 16K, all without BIOS files. However, if you want to emulate Pentagon 128K, Pentagon 512K, Pentagon 1024, or Scorpion 256K, you do need BIOS files, and they need to be under a Fuse subfolder in your Retroarch system folder. I don't have these BIOS files, and I haven't come across a game that I've downloaded from World of Spectrum that has needed them yet, so you shouldn't need this for a vast majority of things, but do be aware that this is going to be a necessary step if you happen to come across one of these types of systems. But now that we have our games, let's talk about storing them on Xbox Series X for use. So if you have a selection of games that are only a single file, these can be stored on USB and ran just fine without any worries. But there are some games that come with two sides of the same tape, and I'm honestly not sure what the proper way of handling this is. I've tried doing it as an M3U playlist, but the ZX Spectrum core doesn't support swapping discs or anything like that, and it wouldn't load from the M3U playlist, so I'm not sure what the correct method of using these are. So I'm just going to put them on USB for now, and if I figure out how these are actually supposed to be used, I will let you know in a future update. But for now, I'm just going to dump my entire ZX Spectrum games folder onto my USB drive. And now that I have all of my games placed, I can close everything down on my computer and switch over to my Xbox. Now over on the Xbox, you can place your USB drive into one of the USB ports, and it should pop up automatically if you've been using this drive on your Xbox previously. If this is the first time that you're putting this drive into an Xbox, it will ask you if you want to format it as Xbox storage or use it as media storage. Choose media. Unless you like having all your stuff deleted and starting over from scratch, I guess if that's your thing, you could do that, but I'm not one of them. I'm not one of those people, so I'm going to choose media. Anyway, now that the drive's in place, I'm ready to load up Retroarch. Now, just as a quick reminder, this guide is a continuation of my original Retroarch install video, so please refer back to that video for any initial settings used here. But now that we got that out of the way, we're free to begin loading up ZX Spectrum content, so you could do this by going... And you know what? Rather than showing you the load content method, I'm just going to skip over to the playlist creation method because I'm tired of wasting time. So just go over to the right here to where it says import content. From here, we're going to go down to manual scan. Content directory, I have all my stuff stored on the external drive, so I'm going to go to E, go to my ZX Spectrum games folder, tell it to scan this directory, system name, press right on your D-pad to go down to Sinclair, ZX Spectrum, and default core, same thing, press right on your D-pad to go down to Sinclair and choose ZX Spectrum Fuse. Now make sure scan recursively is on if you have anything in subfolders, and if you have any of your games zipped, make sure scan inside archives is on. But once you have these options set, go ahead and start the scan. And once the scan is complete, there should be a nice new ZX Spectrum playlist somewhere over here on the right. And here it is. And now that this playlist is made, I could just go down to a game, press A, and press A again on run. And there we go, ZX Spectrum games booted up on an Xbox Series X. This is so cool. Now, for ZX Spectrum games, I really recommend having a keyboard attached to your Xbox Series X, as the ZX Spectrum use keyboard input and joystick input depending on the game, so it's just going to make your life a heck of a lot easier if you have a keyboard hooked up. But let's go over some things that you need to set up before you're able to start playing games. So if you go into your quick menu, scroll down to the controls options, port 1 controls. By default, it is set as RetroPad, and we don't want this set as RetroPad because it doesn't work for a lot of things. So instead, change this to one of the joystick options. So depending on the game, certain joysticks may or may not work. I'm not too sure about how the ZX Spectrum joystick system works a whole lot. I set mine to Sinclair 1 joystick, and it seems to work for everything that I've downloaded so far. But set this as a joystick, and then under port 3 controls, set this to the keyboard. This way you can have access to joystick input and keyboard input at the same time. And then if you're going to have 2 players, you could set the second player to a joystick as well. But now I can use my physical keyboard to control Donkey Kong Jr. here. So I'm going to press scroll lock on my keyboard to make sure game focus mode is on. And this will redirect all of my keyboard inputs into the ZX Spectrum emulator. So for example, Donkey Kong Jr. here, it's asking me to use the number 1 key to choose what type of input I'm using. So I'm just going to leave it on keyboard for now. The number 2 changes between player numbers. Number 4 turns music on and off. And then number 3 starts the game. And there we go. We just got to figure out what buttons do what here. So it looks like Z is to move back, X is to move forward. Not sure what jump is yet. Okay, so I have no idea what the keyboard controls for this game are, so I'm going to change this over to one of the joystick input options. So let's see here. Kempston, I saw that in the quick menu, so I'm going to go back into the quick menu, go down to port 1 controls and the controls options, and I'm going to change this to the Kempston joystick here. There we go. So now I'm going to press 3 to start up a game, and there we go. Now I can play Donkey Kong Jr. on ZX Spectrum through Xbox Series X. Fantastic. Now, another thing to take note of, if you don't happen to have a keyboard you can hook up to your Xbox, you can also control menus and stuff by pressing the back button of your controller, and you could select input buttons with your D-pad and then press B to select that key. This won't really be that effective for games that require keyboard input, but for games that you can set up joysticks, this is going to work out pretty well. So depending on the game you're playing, your control options are going to be really varied. So for California games, for example, I don't think it supports joystick inputs, and the keyboard inputs are so odd. Like, you have to use Q to scroll up in the menu. I don't know how to scroll down in A is to scroll down in the menu. There we go. Then you can press spacebar to go into something. And again, I'm not even really sure how to play this game. So I do recommend having control layouts up in front of you before you try to play any of these games, just to make your lives a lot simpler. And there we go. I think I finally figured it out. Yep, there we go. So O and P are my my turn keys here. It's so odd. But now that we understand the core concepts of running ZX Spectrum games, having the keyboard hooked up, having the joysticks hooked up, and knowing that we are going to need to change them depending on the games, I think we're ready to kind of dive into some more of the advanced core options. So going into our quick menu, you can scroll down to Options. And the first option available to us is to choose the model of our ZX Spectrum. So we could choose between the 48K, the 48K NTSC, the 128K, 2, 2A, 3, 3A, SE, and the Timex versions, and then the 16K. Again, if you want to use the Pentagon 128, 512, 1024, or the Scorpion 256K, you need additional BIOS files that I have not covered in this video. For the most part, it looks like the Spectrum 48K is able to run most everything, but you can also just mix it up, see what happens. And if you do want to choose a new system, you have to select it and then reload the content. Our next option is to hide the video border, so this will let you have a bigger image on your display. Next up, tape fast load, leave this on, otherwise load times are ridiculously long. Tape load sound, so the audio output will emulate what the tape deck sounds like. Then you can choose your speaker type between TV speaker, beeper, or unfiltered. I like the TV speaker personally. Next is an AY stereo separation, so I guess this tries to mimic stereo sound. I'm not quite sure what this does. Haven't messed with it a whole lot. Next up is the transparent keyboard layout overlay, so if you don't want it to be transparent, you can turn it off. If you want it to be transparent, leave it on. Then you can set the milliseconds it takes to release keys. And then next we have joypad mappings for every button on our joypad. So if you don't want to hook up a real keyboard to your Xbox to use ZX Spectrum emulation, you can map any individual keyboard key to your Xbox controller to play games. So this is great if you know exactly what keys are needed for a specific game. You can set them in here and then you can save it as a game override. Personally, I prefer to use a keyboard on my Xbox for ZX Spectrum, so I don't have to mess with any of these, but this is going to be important for those of you that don't want to do that for games that don't support joystick import and you have to use the keyboard. But that's really going to do it as far as the core options are concerned, not a whole lot to tweak in here. But before we call this video good, let's go over shaders real quick. So you can go into the shaders tab, enable shaders by pressing A on the slider. Do make sure that you have shaders downloaded, so you can go back to the main menu, Online Updater, update GLSL shaders, and once those have downloaded and extracted, you can go back into the quick menu and into the shaders tab. From here, you can go to load shader preset, shaders GLSL, and choose any number of different shaders available to you. I prefer CRT shaders myself, and for an 80s system like the ZX Spectrum, I like to use the YO6KVM1420B shader. Makes it look like an older CRT, and I just absolutely love it. But I'm going to save this as a core preset, so that way every time I load up a ZX Spectrum game, this is the shader that will greet me. But yes, I think this just looks absolutely fantastic. Still looks a lot better than most TVs would have at the time of playing ZX Spectrum, but it still looks pretty good to me. And I just think it's kind of crazy that Star Wars Arcade came out on ZX Spectrum. Like, this is nuts. Like, it doesn't run as good as the arcade version, obviously, but like, this is impressive for what the ZX Spectrum is. I also find it nuts that ZX Spectrum games came on cassette tapes. Like, cassette tape games are just the most fascinating thing to me, and I wish that I could have experienced them more. But I think that's really going to do it as far as this video is concerned. As always, if you happen to have any questions about running ZX Spectrum games on your Xbox Series X or S, feel free to ask me in the comments section below, and I will do my best to try to help you out. But for the most part, this one seems pretty straightforward, and there's even a nice way to get legal versions of the games available for you. But now, if you could all do me just a huge favor, and be sure to hit that like or dislike button, just depending on how much you like today's video. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that sub button so you can see when new content just like this goes live. Really goes a long way to helping out the channel, and I am just most grateful to all of you for that. But that's where we're going to call it, so until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, stay awesome, and we will see you all back next video.